One of the things I wanted to do in the beginning of the book was to lay out a set of postures that I think can help orient us toward the challenge of discussing violence in the Bible.
Yeah.
So they're not that section is not so interested in exactly hitting the problem head on, but like what are some maybe hermeneutical principles we could lay down or think about in terms of our stance toward the Bible. So one of them is, among others, is to let scripture, the shape of scripture, help guide us into how to interpret scripture. And part of that is the primacy given to Genesis 1 to 11 by virtue of its canonical position, but also the fact that it sets up a lot of the problems and issues and subject matter that the rest of the Bible is going to deal with. And you can see the importance of it, for instance, when looking at male female relationships in the Bible, where if you start with the problem passages in Timothy or wherever about what women can't do, then I think you're starting in the wrong place. And so the Bible kind of gives us, it comes to us not as a collection of sayings, but as a story with a shape to it, and attending to that is important. And so if we start in Genesis 1, we have a portrait of a world that is decidedly nonviolent. And I talk about that in the book and get into why I think
Mhm.
it's overtly nonviolent. Um, and especially if read against the ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, it's pretty striking that, first of all, the Bible doesn't start with a story of divine combat
Yeah.
or the subjugation of violent subjugation and chaos. um, the sea creatures, which are elsewhere, even in Scripture, hostile creatures, are called to multiply, and they're God seems to take delight in them. Humans are given the power to rule, but they're not given the power to eat animals. Um, they're called to rule over realms that they can't possibly control, and so rule is going to have to look different if it isn't about control and domination. And so, in many ways, Genesis 1 is giving us this vision of a world characterized by wholeness and peace and shalom, to use the Hebrew term.
Yeah.
So, that foregrounding of that story is important, but also as it unfolds, the story begins to tell about creation itself unraveling in terms of the entrance of violence into the world. So, one of the things that threatens fundamentally creation's integrity is violence.
Mhm.
And so violence is an ecocidal phenomenon in scripture. And so if we sort of follow that story, then letting Genesis 1 to 11 set the terms helps us see that the Bible itself has a vision of a world characterized by peace, of creation destroying violence, and then the rest of God's redemptive work is toward the restoration of creation toward that peace-filled end. I
Yeah.
would say the restoration and exceeding of that original vision in the end. So I think that's like part of why I say, like, let's start with Genesis 1 to 11, where the Bible, makes its entrance.
Yeah, and one of the things I've thought about more recently is the idea of, like, the story of the scripture is trying to get back to Eden,
Hmm.
getting back to this, like, peace that you mentioned, the
Yeah.
shalom. So what is, I guess, like, because obviously there's gonna be sometimes people will give pushback on these passages where it's like, well, those are just written from the perspective of the people that won or the conqueror.
Hmm.
What is kinda like your approach to that?
Yeah, they're written from the perspective of the people who didn't win. So
Yeah.
one of the difficulties of reading the Bible in North America is that we do sit atop the heap in terms of nation state power, and it's what we should be calling into question is the degree to which we summon the Bible to legitimate the kinds of like the society we live in, the violence it depends on, and and the power that we hold and the effect that that has for people on the bottom of society. So Israel's literature comes to us from a people who were trampled between the major nations of the world. They were a little land bridge between the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and eventually the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Like it comes out of that struggle. And so it comes to us from a people who knew violence firsthand, who were victims of violence, and saw through that the goodness of God. And so this like claims about God's mercy enduring forever, his covenantal loyalty are hard won. And so yes, to some extent I could see the pushback where someone
Yeah.
says, well, even so within that little nation state of Judah, the Bible comes to us from scribes who were the elite in society. And there's some truth to that. But that assumes that there wasn't a kind of communal dimension to the scribal process, which I think there certainly was, in the production and retention and affirmation of what counted as scripture too. So yeah, just doesn't come from the top, comes from the bottom.
Yeah, yeah, and I hear that sometimes, and then it's like, well, do you pay attention to the story of Israel? Most of their, identity is found in exile. So
Yeah,
it's kind of like it's like, yes, sort of, but we have to
yeah,
take into account everything, the whole storyline.
absolutely. And most scholars think that a lot of the Bible reached its final form, at least during the exile and
Yeah,
post-exilic period, when we're well past the so-called glory days of David and Solomon and Hezekiah. I mean, this is like they've lost their land, their army, their king, their temple in the exile, come back to the land, and it's the population's about 10% of what it was before going into exile, and about 10% of the former land of Judah, which was itself, a third of the former Israelite kingdom. So that's the time period out of which this comes, and I think that has to be kept in mind.
yeah. What are so as you've been, we're working through writing this book, what were some, I guess, resources that you lean towards in your research and kind of helped you create, I guess, an approach to the
Mhm.
passage that people struggle with?
Yeah.
Passages.
Yeah. So a couple of things come to mind. One is the emergence of literary approaches to the Bible. It's been really
Yeah.
helpful to engage with that literature. That's been around for a while now. Really, the early '80s is when scholars began to look at the Bible as serious literature and not
Mhm.
just the primitive product of primitive people who
Yeah.
sat around campfires and couldn't tell a story that lasted
Yeah.
more than 5 minutes.
Yeah. No, these
Um,
people were brilliant. It's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
insane.
absolutely. And so that makes me I think the instinct that gives me as a reader then when I go to the stories of scripture is to ask the question, like, what is the writer doing by introducing this level of complexity to the story? For instance, in Joshua, like why on the one hand do we have this thread running through the book that they wiped out everything that breathed, they left nothing alive, and they completed the conquest, and then this other thread over here that says there were lots of Canaanites running around all over the place still. And Joshua at the end of his life doesn't seem to see that as a failure.
Yeah.
So rather than saying this is an amalgam of sources that a clumsy writer brought together, I'm asking a different question because of those literary approaches to the Bible. So that's one thing. Also, there's been some great work on the history of Canaan, say in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age when Israel's emerging in the land. So, looking at that literature helped me think about the context of the so called conquest and remembering, for instance, and you don't get this from Joshua, but that Canaan, during the time when Israel's coming into the land and emerging out of the land itself, Egypt dominated Canaan. So, in many ways, the conquest is the second part of the Exodus,
Mhm.
where they're still coming
Yeah.
out from under the power of Egypt and Egyptian domination. This gets back to the point earlier about the Bible coming out of people on the bottom of society.
Yeah, suffering.
And so, I think it's a different ethical framing if you remember that this is imperial controlled land and not land that's otherwise untouched by outsiders. And bearing that in mind and pairing it with the fact that most of Israel's battles, or all of them really, are against walled cities where these Egyptian-backed Canaanite kings are exercising their power. So really what they're doing is going around and breaking the stranglehold that Egypt has on the land of Canaan. That changes our picture as well. So historical approaches, literary approaches, and then combining that with some thinking about how we wrestle ethically with the Bible.
Yeah.
I would say those lenses have been really helpful.
Yeah, and I think that those things are really helpful for people that are just like day-to-day readers. I guess you could say
Uh-huh.
that they're not doing research or anything like that. And I think the big thing that people will sometimes struggle with, at least in my experience personally, is
Mhm.
what do these passages tell me about God?
Mhm.
And how should I view God? Like
Mhm.
how should I approach God? On like one hand, I see these passages of like sometimes of instruction, and then
Mhm.
I see in the New Testament Jesus where he's like, turn the other cheek and let your enemy
Mhm.
slap you.
Mhm.
And so it's like this balance of trying to understand,
Yeah.
that approach.
Yeah, I think, well, a couple of things. First of all, Jesus commands about "You have heard it said, but I tell
Yeah,
you," like, those ideas are firmly rooted in the Old Testament itself. Jesus isn't
yeah,
coming up with brand new ideas. I think he has a creative bringing together of already existing ideas. So it's not to say there's nothing that would have sounded fresh to his
yeah,
listeners. But on the other hand, like the idea of kindness to your enemy is already there in the book of Proverbs and so on. Um,
yeah,
but on the question of God's character, I think that's really the fundamental question.
yeah,
And what it comes down to for most of us that wrestle with violence in the Bible is okay, I can acknowledge that there's complexity in the text and that I'm not going to be able to resolve this, but what then can I say about God? Like who God is? Can I trust this God who's presented to me in scripture, or do I need to develop my theology from elsewhere and over against scripture? And I think for some people, or from maybe select few scriptures. So I think for a lot of people, that feels like the dilemma they're in.
mhm,
Like, if I discard the Bible altogether, where am I building my theology from?
yeah,
And if I embrace the Bible, can I really use the whole Bible to
yeah,
help me think about my doctrine of God? And that's why I went to these problem texts because part of my conviction, and this is my bias. You mentioned a bias at the beginning,
yeah,
is that this scripture somehow leads to a person like Jesus. And not just in the story arc of scripture, but also in the sense that Jesus immersed himself in the Hebrew scriptures as a law-keeping, faithful Israelite man
yeah,
and boy. And so if he did that, and we can see from the gospels that he's a very sophisticated reader of scripture,